It really hits you when you see the numbers. Just over 1%
Wow. Yeah.
of the financial resources dedicated to getting the gospel across cultures actually reaches places where it, well, hasn't really taken root yet.
Mm.
That makes you wonder, doesn't it? Are we? Are we as effective as we could be in sharing what we believe?
It's a stark statistic, yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely compels us to examine our approaches and priorities, absolutely.
And that's exactly what we're going to do in this deep dive. You've shared a really thought-provoking piece called Missions, a witness to the gospel where there is none.
Right.
So our goal today is to unpack what missions truly means in our modern context, maybe understand some of the history that shapes our thinking, and explore more effective ways forward. We want to give you a much clearer picture of this crucial area.
Sounds good.
So to start, even the words we use, they seem to carry a lot of weight. What's the significance of the difference between mission and missions, that little S?
Well, yeah, that seemingly small tales actually points to a really significant shift in understanding over time. If you go back to the 19th and early 20th centuries, the idea of mission, singular, was largely about, the gospel moving from the West to other parts of the world.
The classic image, right. Missionaries setting sail for distant shores.
Right, exactly. But as the global church grew, especially through the 20th century, the term mission started to expand. It began to encompass, really, the entire work of the church in witnessing to the gospel everywhere.
Okay.
Max Warren even talked about the end of missions as we have known them, signaling this much broader view.
So mission became this big, all-encompassing idea, but here's where it gets really interesting, I think. You mentioned Leslie Newbigin. During his time at the International Review of Missions, he really championed keeping the distinction of missions. Why? Why was he so insistent on that?
That's a great question. While Newbigin certainly appreciated the wider understanding of mission, his big concern was that the specific, absolutely vital task of taking the gospel to those who haven't heard it, what we're focusing on as missions, with an S, was actually in danger of being overlooked.
Getting lost in the shuffle.
Kind of, yeah. He felt it was becoming diluted within this more general concept. The source draws an analogy, actually. It's a bit like that early church debate over homoousios versus homoousios.
Whether Jesus was of the same substance or similar substance as God.
Exactly. A tiny difference in spelling, but with huge theological implications. Keeping the "as" in missions, for Newbigin, had similar weight protecting a crucial, specific task.
That analogy really clarifies the weight of that single letter. Okay, so for our conversation today, when we say missions, we'll specifically mean that essential work of bringing the gospel to places where there's little to no witness yet.
Precisely.
Now, your source also distinguishes missions from something else, cross-cultural partnership.
Wow.
What's the difference there?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So just to recap, mission, big picture, is the whole calling of the church to be a witness everywhere. Missions, with the S, is that narrower focus, establishing witness where it's absent or very weak.
Got it.
Cross-cultural partnership, then, is different again. It involves churches from different cultural backgrounds working together to support efforts where a church already exists.
Okay.
Think of the example in your source, someone from, say, the U.S. teaching in a seminary in Kenya. They're crossing cultures, yes, but they're there to strengthen an existing Christian community, not to start a new one from scratch.
So it's more about coming alongside what's already there.
Exactly.
Rather than planting the first seed.
You've got it. And cross-cultural partnership is incredibly valuable. I mean, it fosters unity, allows for mutual learning and growth, critique from the outside even. It really shows the global nature of the church.
Sure.
But the key difference to keep laser focused on is that missions is about creating that initial spark of witness, while partnership is more about fanning an existing flame.
Okay. I think that distinction is becoming much clearer. But why is it so important that we, really understand these differences? What are the potential downsides if we get fuzzy with our terminology?
Well, there are several really important reasons. First, being clear helps us avoid what could be seen, maybe unintentionally, as a kind of colonial mindset.
Oh, so?
Well, if we don't differentiate, we might subconsciously just equate missions with anything Christians do overseas, which can subtly perpetuate those older power dynamics,
Viewing ourselves, maybe in the West, as always the senders and everyone else is just the receivers.
Precisely. That's a danger. Second, and this is really critical, these distinctions help us ensure that our resources, people and money are actually directed effectively.
Right.
We really want to avoid a situation where the urgent need to reach the unreached gets overshadowed by the very important but different work of supporting churches that are already established.
Right.
As your source quotes Bryant Myers, the current imbalance in resource allocation. He calls it a scandal.
That's a strong word. But the numbers you mentioned earlier, that 1%, they certainly seem to back that up.
They really do. The fact that such a tiny percentage of missionary funding and personnel actually targets areas with little or no gospel witness is, well, it's something we need to grapple with seriously.
Yeah.
Maybe a key question for you listening is, when you think about supporting missionary work, what portion of those resources is truly going towards establishing a witness where one doesn't exist?
Oof. That's a really direct and important question for all of us to consider.
Absolutely. And third, keeping missions distinct reminds us that the church's overall mission has a global scope, a universal horizon. While we're absolutely called to witness right here in our own communities, that calling always extends to the ends of the earth.
Can't just stay local.
Can't just stay local. And finally, the source argues something quite profound, that missions, this specific task, isn't just one piece of the puzzle. It actually provides the ultimate redemptive historical horizon, the perspective and direction for the entire mission of the church.
Wow. So
Without that focus on reaching the unreached, our whole understanding of mission itself can become, as the source puts it, emaciated and parochial, limited, inward-looking.
emaciated and parochial concept. That phrase really sticks with me. Okay, so when we look back at, say, the modern missionary movement, 19th, 20th centuries, how does understanding this distinction help us evaluate that whole era?
It gives us a much more nuanced perspective, I think. On the one hand, we can recognize the genuine, often sacrificial desire to take the gospel to those who had never heard it. And we can be incredibly grateful for the spread of the church globally, which was partly a result of that.
Sure, acknowledge the good intentions and outcomes.
Definitely. But on the other hand, we also need to critically examine the methods used and, maybe more importantly, the underlying cultural assumptions that often came bundled with that movement.
The how was sometimes problematic, maybe, even if the why was often well-intentioned.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. The missionary enterprise back then often inadvertently, sometimes quite critically, adopted aspects of the Enlightenment worldview and the whole colonial framework it operated within.
Okay.
And this led to things like a perceived superiority of Western culture, a blurring of the lines between the actual gospel message and its Western cultural expression, and, some deeply troubling entanglements with colonialism and imperialism itself.
Right, that baggage is undeniable.
It is. And scholars like James Engel and William Durness pointed to what they call the invasion of modernity into Christianity, particularly that split between the sacred and the secular. That had huge consequences for how mission was understood and practiced.
And what were some of those specific negative consequences you mentioned? The source highlights a few.
Yeah, it does. There was often, for example, an overemphasis on individual evangelism, sometimes at the expense of social action or a more holistic understanding of what discipleship means.
Just getting decisions, maybe, not building whole lives or communities.
That's one critique, yes. We also saw the rise of what's been termed managerial missiology, where organizational efficiency, strategies, numbers sometimes seem to take precedence over the organic life and work of the church itself.
Like a mission as a business, almost?
It could sometimes feel that way, yeah.
Yeah.
And related to our earlier point, the specific focus on missions, that task of reaching the truly unreached, sometimes got absorbed or lost within a broader understanding of mission that didn't necessarily prioritize the crucial initial outreach. Or conversely, mission got reduced just to missions overseas, letting the church at home off the hook for critiquing its own culture.
So a narrowing in some ways, maybe a broadening in others, but not always in the most helpful directions. Interesting. How did the wider church respond to this complicated legacy in the 20th century?
Well, the source points to two main streams of response, particularly within Protestantism. You had the ecumenical movement, which became very, very aware of the negative impacts of modernity and colonialism on missions. And this led, in some circles, to a degree of disillusionment, maybe even embarrassment, and sometimes a distancing from that specific task of reaching the unreached. Sort of a, we're not in the missions game anymore feeling in some quarters.
Almost a sense of guilt by association, perhaps.
You could say that, yeah, in some ways. On the other hand, you had the evangelical tradition, which largely maintained its strong commitment to missions, to reaching the unreached.
Right.
But sometimes, perhaps, continued with established practices, sort of business as usual, without always doing the hard work of critically examining the underlying modern assumptions and the colonial legacy.
Yeah.
Maybe more like entrenchment than critical reevaluation in some cases.
So two different reactions, neither perhaps fully hitting the mark.
Well, the crucial point the source makes is that we absolutely need to distinguish the biblical task, the mandate, to take the gospel where it isn't known from the flawed methods or cultural baggage of the past. We can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so how do we ensure our methods are aligned with that core mandate? The source talks about a return to Scripture. What are some of the key biblical principles that should guide us here?
Yeah, the source emphasizes four really foundational elements. First, simply, the gospel is true, and it's universally significant. It's meant for all people, all nations, everywhere. That's non-negotiable.
Okay, bedrock truth.
Bedrock truth. Second, God's mission right from the beginning has always had a global perspective, a universal horizon. From the earliest promises to Abraham through the story of Israel, the vision of Zion, we see God's intention to bless all nations. God chooses some, yes, but always for the sake of all.
So it was never meant to be exclusive just for one group. It was always outward looking.
Exactly. A plan from the beginning to reach the whole world. Third, the book of Acts gives us a vital pattern, particularly the account of the church in Antioch in chapters 11 through 13.
Antioch, right.
As analyzed by scholars like Wilbert Schenck, we see both what he calls an organic mode of mission, just the everyday witness of believers living out their faith and challenging the surrounding culture, and ascending mode where the church intentionally commissions and sends out messengers, like Paul and Barnabas.
Ah, so it's both. Living it out where we are and actively going to new places.
Precisely. It's not either. And this provides a really important paradigm for the ongoing work of the church. And fourth, flowing from that, the source underscores that missions, that specific sending aspect, going where the witness is absent, is, first and foremost, the responsibility of the local church.
Not primarily an agency or society, but the congregation itself.
That's the argument. While partnering with other churches and specialized organizations is obviously important, maybe essential, the initial impulse, the ownership, the primary sending structure should reside within the local community of believers.
That shifts the focus quite significantly, doesn't it? Away from just writing a check to an agency.
It does. It puts the onus right back on the local congregation.
Okay. Now, fast forward to today. With Christianity now present in virtually every country, how do we actually identify where that initial gospel witness, that missions task, is still critically needed?
Yeah, that's the challenge, isn't it? And this is where the concept of unreached people groups, or UPGs, has become a really valuable, if sometimes debated, tool.
Right, I've heard that term.
As your source explains, this idea really arose within evangelical circles, starting notably around the Lausanne Congress in 1974, specifically to highlight the remaining unfinished task of reaching distinct groups of people who haven't had a meaningful opportunity to hear and understand the gospel in their own context.
So it's about finding those pockets, those groups that have been missed.
Essentially, yes. Harvey Kahn, for instance, emphasized that while local churches can and should reach their own immediate communities, there are literally billions of people who, realistically, can only be reached if someone intentionally crosses cultural and linguistic boundaries to bring the message to them.
And people like Ralph Winter were key in developing this. And organizations like the Joshua Project track this data.
Exactly. Winter was hugely influential at Lausanne 74, and later figures like David Barrett and Patrick Johnstone did massive work in identifying and quantifying these groups. The Joshua Project is one contemporary resource that tries to maintain this data.
But how do you actually define a people group in this context? It sounds like it could get complicated. And what makes them specifically unreached?
It can be complex, absolutely. And there are different models. Some focus primarily on language, others on ethnicity. Some use a combination, what's called ethno-linguistic. There are other models too. But the underlying purpose of all these approaches is to identify the largest possible group of people where the gospel can potentially spread naturally, without hitting significant cultural or linguistic barriers within that group. It's about finding the most natural community for the gospel to take root and flourish.
Okay, finding the right soil, so to speak.
That's a good analogy. And as for being unreached, the crucial definition, the one most commonly used, is whether there exists within that people group an indigenous community of believing Christians that has sufficient numbers and resources to actually evangelize the rest of their own people group without needing ongoing outside cross-cultural assistance.
Ah, so it's not just about whether any Christians exist there, but whether there's a viable, local, self-sustaining church movement within that specific group.
Precisely. Missions, in this specific sense, isn't considered complete in relation to that group until such a church exists, one that's culturally relevant and capable of reaching its own people.
And that cultural relevance piece, contextualization, is key, right? The gospel has to make sense within their world.
Absolutely paramount. It has to be communicated and lived out in a way that resonates within that specific cultural context. Now, it's important to say there are ongoing discussions and even debates about the usefulness and application of the UPG concept, especially in complex multi-ethnic urban settings. Samuel Wilson raised some of those questions.
Right, cities are messy.
They are. And others like Kahn and Ortiz argued for a broader view of people groups and cities, maybe based on residence or class or shared interests. But even with those caveats, the UPG concept remains a valuable tool, a functional instrument for focusing our attention and resources on where the gospel witness is weakest or non-existent. It helps us avoid the trap of thinking the job's nearly done just because Christianity is globally widespread.
So it's a helpful lens, even if not a perfect one.
I think that's fair, yes. It helps keep the unfinished task in view.
Okay. Beyond the specific UPG concept, the source also mentions looking at broader blocks of people and also the 1040 window. Can you unpack those for us?
Sure. Well, the UPG concept gives that more granular focus. Some analysts have also looked at larger groupings to highlight need. Harvey Kahn, again, maybe a bit humorously but pointedly, suggested focusing on the major religious blocs, thinking primarily of Muslims, Hindus, and the peoples of China, just recognizing the sheer number of people within these massive categories who have historically had very limited access to the gospel. We're talking billions of people.
Sheer scale.
Sheer scale. Though, of course, that's a very blunt instrument, as the source points out. There's immense diversity within Islam, Hinduism, and certainly within China.
Right. Can't paint with too broad a brush.
Definitely not. Then there's the 1040 window. This term was popularized by Louis Bush, particularly around the Lausanne II Conference in Manila in 1989. It refers geographically to that rectangular area, or belt, stretching across North Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, roughly between 10 degrees and 40 degrees north latitude.
Okay, a specific geographical zone. And why is this area considered so significant for missions?
Well, Bush and others highlighted several key reasons. First, it's simply where most of the world's people live. Something like 2/3 of the global population resides in that window. Second, it contains the vast majority of the world's least evangelized peoples and countries. Maybe 95, 97% of the population of the 50 or so least evangelized countries are within that zone.
Wow.
Third, it's the heartland of the major non-Christian religious blocs: Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism. Fourth, it's home to the majority of the world's poorest people. And fifth, despite all this, historically, only a very small percentage of cross-cultural missionaries, maybe less than 10%, were actually working within the 1040 window.
So a massive concentration of population, spiritual need, physical need, and yet historically neglected by missionary efforts.
Exactly. The statistics from resources like the Joshua Project still show a huge concentration of unreached people groups and major unevangelized cities within this window. So it serves as a helpful strategic concept to identify and prioritize some of the most significantly neglected areas for gospel outreach.
Got it. And within that broader region, Asia itself stands out, right? Even outside the specific 1040 window definition, the need there seems immense.
Absolutely immense. Jason Mandrick's research, cited in the source, really underscores this. Over 80% of the world's non-Christians live in Asia. It's the birthplace and heartland of most major non-Christian religions. Many Asian countries still have tiny Christian percentages, and statistically, most of the remaining unreached people groups are located there.
And the source specifically mentions the opportunity and the neglect of Asian slums.
Yes. Viv Grieg's work highlights this powerfully. The urban poor, particularly in the massive slums of Asia, represent perhaps the fastest-growing distinct cultural bloc on Earth. They often face immense social needs, yet studies suggest they are often remarkably responsive to the gospel message when it's presented relevantly.
But they're often overlooked.
Tragically, yes. They tend to be least targeted by traditional mission efforts. Very few city churches, except perhaps in places like Korea, are located in the slums or have effective outreach to the slums. There's a real lack of what Grieg calls poor people's church movements in many of these contexts, so it represents both a huge need and a huge, often missed opportunity.
It's sobering. It's clear that despite the amazing global spread of Christianity, significant, specific needs remain. So let's turn to the obstacles. What are some of the major challenges hindering a renewed and effective focus on missions, on reaching these unreached areas today?
Yeah, the source identifies several key obstacles, and they're quite profound. The first one it tackles is, perhaps surprisingly, a simple lack of fervor within the church itself.
Lack of passion.
Lack of passion, lack of urgency, yeah. It draws on Andrew Murray's analysis from way back over a century ago, where he talked about depleting resources, but identified the core issue as a lack of will. He called it the missionary problem.
Wow, over 100 years ago.
Indeed. Murray stressed the need for pastors to prioritize making Christ known globally, for ordinary Christians to engage deeply with news of the kingdom's advance, for seminaries to instill missionary passion. But even deeper, he saw the need for spiritual revival, fervent devotion, real prayer. He said the missionary problem is a personal one.
Hits close to home, and how does the source see that playing out today?
Well, it suggests contemporary reasons for this lack of fervor might include things like creeping relativism, maybe particularly in the ecumenical tradition, or perhaps a kind of self-satisfaction, consumerism, even materialism within parts of the evangelical tradition, what someone called the triumph of a self-centered lifestyle. Both can effectively dampen that outward-focused passion.
A sort of spiritual apathy or complacency that hinders action.
Precisely. And Murray's remedy, echoed in the source, involves things like deep prayer, confession, intercession for missions, prayer for revival, sacrificial giving, intentional education about world needs, strong leadership, and ultimately the sovereign work of the Holy Spirit.
So a deep spiritual root to this problem. What's the second challenge?
The second significant challenge is the one we've already touched upon: the continued inadequate allocation of mission resources.
The numbers again.
The numbers again. The fact that estimates suggest well over 90% of resources designated for missions actually goes towards cross-cultural partnerships, strengthening existing churches, leaving only a tiny fraction, maybe around 1% or 1.2%, for work in the least evangelized areas among unreached peoples.
It's just a massive imbalance.
It's a massive imbalance. Chuck Bennett called it that. Todd Johnson pointed out that maybe over 90% of all Christian evangelistic effort is actually aimed at other Christians. There are various stats cited from Urbana conferences, Myers, Guthrie, all pointing to this same stark reality. A disproportionately small amount of money and personnel goes to where the gospel witness is weakest or absent, especially within that 1040 window.
It seems almost counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does. It raises serious questions about stewardship and strategic focus.
Okay, and the third major obstacle mentioned.
The third is that lingering, complex legacy of colonialism.
Back to that again.
Back to that again, because it's pervasive. Colonialism wasn't just a political system. It was a framework that deeply shaped mindsets, practices, even organizational structures in missions, and its effects linger.
How does that hinder things now?
Well, as we discussed, it can contribute to collapsing missions into just any cross-cultural activity, diluting the focus on the unreached. It also deeply complicates finances. The financial power still largely resides in the West, creating a real risk of unhealthy dependence, even when the intention is good stewardship. It's incredibly difficult for wealthier churches to give generously without unintentionally disempowering poorer churches or fostering paternalism.
Finding that balance of helping without controlling.
Exactly. And this plays out in the relationship between Western mission organizations and national churches, too. There can be lingering financial, spiritual, even strategic paternalism on one side, and maybe an infantile dependence on the other. Moving towards truly multilateral adult-to-adult partnerships is crucial but challenging, especially when it comes to genuinely sharing resources, responsibility, and power.
It sounds like untangling that legacy is essential for moving forward effectively.
Absolutely essential. It requires humility, repentance, and a commitment to building truly equitable relationships.
Okay, so we have these challenges. Lack of fervor, misallocation of resources, and the colonial legacy. Now, the source turns to the structures of missions. It asks, who is ultimately responsible for doing this job? You mentioned earlier the shift towards the local church.
Right. Historically, the responsibility shifted from emperors to popes to monastic orders, then largely to mission societies in the modern era. But today, as we said, there's a huge recovery of the understanding that mission is the task of the whole church, meaning local congregations are primary. And alongside that, we have this explosion of third world missions. So the question becomes, how do these pieces fit together? What does partnership look like now?
Let's break that down. First, local churches and mission societies. How is that relationship evolving?
Well, for a long time, especially in the Protestant world, denominational boards or independent faith mission societies were the main vehicles for missions. But with the theological recovery of the missionary nature of the church itself, the local church is increasingly seen as the primary organ, the main engine.
So the church sends, the society maybe facilitates?
But that's the ideal emerging picture. Thinkers like Engel and Journes argued that the local church is uniquely equipped for mission, but its inherent missional nature got diminished, in a way, by the rise of specialized agencies taking over that function. Newbegin was passionate that every church, however small or poor, should have a share in taking the gospel to the ends of the earth. He saw it as integral to confessing Christ as Lord of all.
A duty and a privilege for everyone.
Exactly. So the challenge is overcoming that ingrained pattern where missions is seen as something over there, done by specialists funded by the church, rather than something the church itself does.
And the source mentioned Tom Telford's criteria for a good church missions program.
Yes, things like having an outward focus, allocating a significant budget percentage, training and educating members, actively sending people, prioritizing prayer, strong pastoral leadership, even helping other churches get involved, alongside robust local evangelism. It paints a picture of a congregation fully engaged.
But this shift, understandably, can create some tensions with the traditional mission societies, right?
Definitely can. As congregations assert their role as the primary senders, questions arise. There could be theological concerns, criticisms about agency rigidity or overhead costs. Agencies are being challenged to adapt.
So what's the way forward there? Is it one or the other?
The source strongly suggests it needs to be partnership. The local church needs to be the primary engine, the sender, the owner. But mission societies still possess invaluable expertise, cross-cultural experience, logistical capabilities, training resources, and the ability to coordinate larger or more complex initiatives. So it calls for a renewed partnership, maybe even a renaissance and transformation of mission organizations to serve and empower local churches more effectively.
Okay, partnership there. Now, what about this incredible growth of third world missions, or maybe better term, missions from the majority world?
Yes, this is arguably one of the most significant shifts in Christianity in the last 50 years. Larry Pate's analysis back in 1991 predicted that non-Western missionaries would soon outnumber Western ones.
And did that happen? There was some debate?
There was some debate about the specific numbers and methodologies. Michael Jafarian, for instance, critiqued some of Pate's assumptions and definitions. A key issue is how you define missionary. If you include vast numbers of Christians working cross-culturally within diverse countries like India or China, reaching different language or ethnic groups that don't yet have an indigenous church, then the numbers are truly massive.
So it depends if you count domestic cross-cultural work as missions.
Exactly. But even using stricter definitions focusing on crossing national borders, the trend is undeniable. The missionary force originating from Africa, Asia, and Latin America is growing rapidly.
Which countries are leading the way?
Operation World statistics, cited in the source, show nations like the U.S. still send large numbers. But countries like Brazil, South Korea, India, China, Nigeria, the Philippines are now major sending nations too. There are initiatives like MAI's Vision 51 Teen aiming to mobilize tens of thousands from Africa. China's potential sending force is staggering. South Korea has had a huge impact for decades, and Samuel Escobar notes significant growth from Latin America. Meanwhile, the traditional Western missionary force has plateaued or is slightly declining.
It's a complete reversal of the map from 100 years ago.
A fundamental shift.
Yeah.
And it really underscores the urgent need for growing cooperation and genuine partnership between these newer sending movements and the older Western structures. It's a global church now, and mission has to reflect that.
Absolutely. So that brings us back to partnership again as the crucial element for the future.
It seems unavoidable and essential. It's been a key goal in missiology for decades, driven by both theology, the church's one body, called to unity and practicality. It's often more effective and efficient to work together.
But those colonial legacies we talked about create real problems for partnership, don't they? Especially around money.
They absolutely do. The historical pattern of Western funding often created unhealthy dynamics. Paternalism on one side, dependence on the other. The goal now is genuine interdependence through multilateral adult relationships. How Western wealth can be shared responsibly, empowering rather than controlling, remains a huge challenge.
A puzzle still being worked out.
Definitely. But despite the very real problems and complexities, the source concludes that partnership is essential. It's, quote, a goal worth fighting for, because it reflects the very nature of the church as a diverse, unified body, a sign of the coming kingdom.
Okay. So recognizing these structures and the need for partnership, the source finally looks at some of the new initiatives emerging in missions today. Older patterns might be changing, but new ways are developing.
Right. Things are definitely evolving. While the idea of the long-term career missionary is still very important, other models and strategies are gaining prominence.
Like, what are some of the most interesting ones?
Well, one significant trend is the increasing emphasis on supporting national missionaries or indigenous workers.
Right, you mentioned this briefly before.
As the church in many parts of the majority world matures, there's a growing recognition that local believers, already immersed in the culture and language, are often the most effective people to reach their own communities or nearby unreached groups. So instead of sending Westerners, the focus shifts to empowering and resourcing these local workers.
Groups like Gospel for Asia are known for this model.
Exactly. K.P. Ohenna's book was very influential. The advantages seem clear. It's usually much lower cost. Workers don't carry the Western baggage. They know the context intimately, and they can often gain access where foreigners can't.
Sounds ideal. Are there downsides or challenges?
There can be. Concerns are sometimes raised about accountability, the potential for funds to create unhealthy dependence or even be misused, and the difficulty, as Robertson McQuilkin noted, of figuring out how to share financial resources in truly empowering ways. It's not a simple solution, but it's a major trend.
Okay. Another initiative mentioned is tent making. What's that about?
Tent making gets its name from the Apostle Paul, who supported himself by making tents while doing ministry. Today, it refers to Christians intentionally using their professional skills and employment as a platform for ministry, especially in countries that might be resistant or closed to traditional missionaries.
So being a doctor or an engineer or a teacher and living out your faith in that context.
Exactly. People talk about kingdom business or kingdom professionals. Tetsuno Yamamori and Ruth Siemens have written about this. The attractions are obvious. It provides legitimate access to difficult places. Workers are often self-supporting or company-supported, and their jobs provide natural, non-threatening contacts with local people for organic evangelism.
What kinds of professions are well suited for this?
Oh, many. The source lists: education, healthcare, agriculture, science, engineering, tech, architecture, urban planning, business, finance, computer science. Lots of possibilities.
Are there any concerns with this approach?
Some questions do arise, like, what's the primary task? Are you mainly an evangelist who happens to have a job, or a professional who also witnesses? There can be concerns about potentially dishonest entry if the job is just a cover. And practically, how much time and energy does a demanding profession leave for actual church planting or intensive discipleship?
Finding the right balance.
Right. Gary Ginter preferred the term kingdom professionals or entrepreneurs to emphasize the legitimacy of the work itself. Ralph Eckhart stressed that doing the job well is crucial for credibility. For those with a more holistic view of vocation, seeing their professional calling itself as a way to bless the nation and witness these tensions might be less problematic.
Makes sense. Okay, one more major trend, short-term missions. This seems ubiquitous now.
It really does. It exploded after World War II with groups like Operation Mobilization and YWAM, and the numbers have increased dramatically in recent decades. Millions of people, especially from North America, go on short trips each year.
But the source puts missions in quotes there. Why the hesitation?
Because the core question is this really missions in the specific sense we've been discussing, establishing a new gospel witness where there is none? The reality is most short-term trips function more like cross-cultural partnership activities or service projects, working alongside existing churches or ministries. They aren't typically starting something brand new among an unreached group.
So they have value, but maybe not primarily as pioneering missions.
Exactly. And the benefits can be significant. For the person who goes, it can be life-changing, raising awareness, challenging ethnocentrism, fostering a heart for the world, maybe leading to a longer-term commitment. And they can bring genuine help, resources, and encouragement to the host location, especially if the trip is well-planned and aligns with long-term local goals.
But there are potential drawbacks, too.
Oh, definitely. The list is quite long. The brief time limits deep language and cultural understanding. Long-term impact is often questionable. It can feed a Western desire for quick fixes and immediate gratification. It's often very expensive per person compared to supporting long-term workers. It can sometimes drain the time and resources of the long-term hosts. And there's always the risk of cultural insensitivity or unintentionally undermining local leadership or structures.
A real mixed bag, then.
It is. But short-term trips are likely here to stay, so the focus needs to be on doing them well, ethically, and effectively. The source mentions standards developed by groups like the Fellowship of Short-Term Mission Leaders, emphasizing God-centeredness, empowering partnerships, mutual design, good administration and training, and careful follow-through.
Ensuring they genuinely help more than they hinder.
That's the goal. Though some question if all those standards can realistically be met in a typical 1 or 2 week trip, it remains a complex area.
It certainly seems like the world of missions is dynamic, constantly evolving, facing old challenges in new ways and developing new strategies.
Absolutely. It's never static.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. To try and bring it all together, we've taken a really deep dive today. We've looked at that crucial distinction between the broad idea of mission and the specific task of missions. We've touched on the historical forces, especially colonialism, that have shaped our understanding and practice. We've seen the evolving landscape of who is involved, the rise of the local church's role, and the incredible growth of missions from the majority world. And we've explored some of these innovative approaches emerging today, supporting national workers, tent making, short-term trips.
It's covered a lot of ground.
It really has. So as we wrap up, maybe a final thought for you listening. Considering the immense needs that clearly still exist around the world and these diverse ways people are trying to engage, what's perhaps one shift, maybe one shift in perspective or one change in action that you think might have the most significant impact right now on effectively sharing the gospel where it's least known? It's evident from our discussion today that this is a continuing journey, and your understanding, your engagement are absolutely vital. Lots to think about there.